This is a lot safer to stand behind here. Wonder. My name is Raftery, and I'm wearing two hats this evening. One is I'm the Historian and Education Manager with Heritage Mississauga. I want to request of everybody, if my voice starts to fade because I'm coming out of the cold, I just need you to let me know, maybe especially in the back row. Okay. As I said, I'm wearing two hats this evening because we're launching our fall lecture series. We're going to be having two of them, and most of you will already have seen the little brochure, the flyer that got you here in the first place, so word of mouth. And just to let you know that we're just finalizing the details of the second series for late October, November, in all probability on the subject. Let's look at it real good. On the subject of audiovisual heritage. So I just thought I'd put that teaser out there so that you're looking for other information. Anyway, welcome, and just great to see you all out this evening. The other hat I'm wearing is your speaker this evening. We do a number of things at Jacks of all trade in the office, and this is how it's working this evening. So what we're going to be doing actually in this series is just exploring the whole topic of villages. A lot of people have commented on the distinct nature of Mississauga being so closely linked to the whole notion of villages, and some here, some no longer here, and that kind of thing. So we're just going to start the series by exploring that. Next week with Verna May coming, we have a really excellent opportunity to look more at the, I guess, the villages that survived. I'll be looking at the villages tonight, most of which have disappeared, all but a few remnants. And next week we're going to get into some of the more historic communities, as we call the actual towns and that kind of thing. And I'll throw out another teaser on behalf of Verna. She's brought another book to the press. So there'll be a book on Cooksville available probably this fall. So that's one of the other reasons we've got her coming in to speak for us. Okay, so I'm not going to hide behind. I'm a preacher. If I get preachy, just duck or wave or something. Because I really get excited about history, especially local heritage. And I guess one of the quotations I always like to start a presentation with is a quotation by Northrop Frye. It just seems so timeless and always so appropriate as a little bit of a reminder, I guess, a jog to the conscience here in Mississauga. He said in 1975, what kind of people we are is perhaps determined and certainly conditioned by what we realize of our past. And sharpening our sense of the past is the only way to meet the future. So I just like to just sort of leave that hovering in the background, because in terms of the lost villages of Mississauga, it sounds very epic. But I mean, they're not, well, I guess they are kind of buried, some of them. But, it's just that if we were to look at ourselves through what we've done through our villages, somehow or other we've lost a really, really interesting heritage. And were it not for some churches and schools, some records saying the post office had been there, and certainly the cemeteries, we really wouldn't know what kind of hubbub of activity had been here, particularly in the 19th century. And there's no question in Mississauga, and I'm going to use the term Mississauga right the way through. I will recognize that until 1968 we're talking about Toronto Township here, but I'm going to use the term Mississauga just for consistency, okay? Mississauga has been described as a city of villages trying to grow from the outside in. That was Roger Riendo in his 1985 publication, The Illustrated History of Mississauga. So far, anyway, still the best comprehensive book on Mississauga, unfortunately out of print. And that's another topic, gap we're trying to fill. But unlike many cities or towns which develop around a focal point of industry or a geological feature, Mississauga has evolved from several historic communities into a modern young city with a diverse economy. The enigma that is Mississauga today is perhaps best understood when you examine the history and patterns of early settlements, particularly European settlements in Toronto Township, as Mississauga, as I said, was formerly called. You can learn a lot about a community by the manner in which it regards its history, or doesn't regard its history. While the histories of Mississauga's towns and villages have been recorded to some extent in a small collection of local histories, individually published histories, these have generally been limited to those individual communities, and it wasn't until Roger Landell published that book just over 10 years ago now that there had been any significant attempt to look at all of these communities in relation to how they made sense of the city that we have today. By the 20th century, the Toronto Township had already experienced the arrival and the disappearance of several villages or hamlets. And I guess the question is, what happened to these villages? When I use the word villages, I think it's probably a better bet to actually think of communities. I'm going to use the word villages just to communicate to you that they were centers of activity where people had reasons to come and go. They were bigger, they were smaller, but that was something that they held in common. But I don't want to confuse you to suggest that they were incorporated villages in the civic sense of the word. And sometimes that gets us a little bit confused here in Mississauga, towns and villages, and where was the border of this one, and where was the border of that one. The interesting thing about Mississauga's villages is that most of them didn't have any bona fide borders as such. They were psychological borders in some cases, or they were borders determined by the marketplace, or something like that. So that's kind of an interesting aspect. In this presentation, we're going to take an armchair tour of some of Mississauga's early villages and hamlets, most of which have either long disappeared or a few which have remained with barely a trace. We'll learn what communities once existed, who settled, and sometimes maybe why. Sometimes we will never figure it out. We won't be focusing, as I said, on the communities that became towns and established villages, because that's something that Vernon is going to explore next week with you. And we'll touch on some of the influences like the railway, the local economy, the landscape, because Garner's here, the survey patterns, and immigration, okay? I think what I'm going to do here is trust myself to technology, press a button, and just go through a few slides which will give you a little bit of a feel for some of these areas. And just to have you recognize that in terms of our slides and things like that at Heritage Mississauga, we're at the beginning of what we hope will be a very exciting outreach development program, so that if you were to see this talk in a year from now, there will be more slides, and we will be doing those for each of the historic communities as a complement to our self-guided tours. Anyway, let's see what we can do here. So far, so good. I'm a history major, I don't understand this. Right. Okay. All right. Does this look familiar to anybody? Don't say cemetery. This is a place called, well, this is what's left of a place called Lisgar. Okay? One time known as Switzer's Corner, after family by that name. Actually, many of you who are acquainted with Mary Manning's books about Streetsville, her family background involves that name, the Switzer name. But in any event, this is basically what we would call West Meadowvale today. And it's at Derry Road in Winston Churchill. And actually, just to everybody's right is a town home complex. And to everybody's left is basically Derry Road. And the really interesting thing about this little cemetery is that this photograph takes in just about the whole cemetery, but look at the size of the monuments. They're totally out of scale with the cemetery. So what does that tell us about Lisgar? There's very little known about Lisgar. We get calls, not infrequently, from residents associations, and they want to know about it, and there's just not a lot about it. We do know that they had a post office once in 1871. We believe it was named for Sir John Young Lisgar, who was a Governor General of Canada in the 1860s. And as with, you're going to hear me say this a few times, the post office opened and then it closed, and then it opened again and it closed. And the best record we have of that that pattern is actually through the federal government's records of where they had various post offices. And I don't know if some of you can recall a number of years ago when rural communities in Canada were losing their post offices, what kind of press was generated. People feel very strongly about their community as reflected through their post office, because that's where they met one another, that's where they chatted, that's where they gossiped. Generally, the post office was located in the general store. What better place to kind of stop the day in motion and get the info you did or didn't need. But that was kind of a real focal point, the post office. And so you've got quite a, and when you go through the little areas and you see all of these openings and closing, you kind of wonder what was going on. And it's probably a reflection of the fact that, as you'll hear me say later, the population in Peel County in the 19th century was a highly transient one. Our notion of it being kind of a calm, staid place where people settled once and didn't move is not accurate. Anyway, so we know that by August 1871 there was a post office there. It closed in 73, opened in 87, and it closed in 1915 again. Actually, a lot of post offices closed in this area around the 1915 time period. In any event, that's what's left of Lisgar today. But I just thought the monuments were just an incredible size. I don't know if you can make up the Switzer name, but that's a little bit more to the left of what you'd seen earlier. And that's the context for Lisgar today. Were it not for that cemetery and the name being here and there a little bit in the community, there would be absolutely no trace that that little place ever existed. There's a lot of research, I hope, to be done yet on these villages and hamlets. And I say I hope because it's my hope that A, that it would be done, and B, that when that decision was made, that there'd be a little bit more information. Certainly the cemeteries in Peel County, as throughout Ontario, have been well recorded, not completely yet, but well recorded by the local branches of the Ontario Genealogical Societies. And they've done a super job. I don't know what the status is on this particular one, but it's basically, if you wanted to get inside, you'd have to get some kind of permission because the gate is closed. And the cemeteries in Mississauga that have been abandoned are actually under the purview of the city of Mississauga, and they do sort of keep up the basic grounds and things like that. So, anyway, that's those part. Okay, some of you will know what this is about. Last week, on the 15th of September, last Sunday, thank you, Mary, there was a dedication to a village or a hamlet, and it was a pretty unique one. This is actually not a view of it. It's an older slide, actually. The old Barber House restaurant, many of you probably know in the Streetsville area. I'm not going to be talking about Streetsville here, so the home of the home of William Barber, which is what we see today when we're driving north on Mississauga Road, is maybe what most of us associate with the old Barber Mills. But a really interesting aspect of the whole heritage there is that it was an incredibly busy, hustling, bustling industrial complex. It's been described actually by Mary Mann as being almost a village in itself. It was never incorporated as a village or anything like that, but it was variously known as Barber Town or Barberton, Barberton being the more modern usage. And actually I've seen references to it being referred to as Credit Vale. In any event, the Barber brothers had purchased some, well, there had been a mill on the site in the early 1830s. And in 1843, I think, the Barber brothers bought the property and basically began what became one of Ontario's best known wool mill complexes. And actually they used to make such fine tweeds as to export them to England and actually have them re-imported to Canada. And you'll appreciate the modern context of this, because but they would be imported as British tweed, because of course Canadians at the time still weren't too into buying Canadian. But British imported wool was considered the best. And So there's lots of wonderful, wonderful stories about the Barber complex. It was one of the, it was the place where the first power loom in Canada was built and used. There is some oral tradition to suggest that the first industrial tea break was there in the 1860s, began there in the 1860s. A lot of firsts associated with it. Another one was the whole idea of being able to have a factory direct kind of a business. And you know, when you go up at Mavis and Britannia and see all the big box retailers and all the factory direct signs, you think, oh, this is new, but it's not. You could actually get a ready-made suit from the mill. They had tailors on the complex. They had brickyards there. We'll be reproducing actually some more slides with respect to Barberton later in the year in connection with an exhibit that we're doing. But actually, I say Barber Woolen Mills. It was actually called Toronto Woolen Mills, but I guess everybody attributes them by their owners' names. But there was mill workers' housing. If any of you are familiar with the little mill workers' houses on the north side of Eglinton as you travel west to Mississauga Road, one of them is a daycare center now. But they're two little houses side by each, very modest structures of about 900 square feet apiece. There are also some mill workers' houses, not in relation to Barber site necessarily in Meadowvale, but they'll give you a good feel for what kind of housing was there. And the really interesting thing about the site was the completeness of it. You have the mill, you have the proprietor living very close to his place of business. You have the mill workers' houses, which numbered about 43, I think. You have the tailoring shop, and as I said, the brickyards and all of this kind of stuff going on. And this was south of Streetsville. Just for purposes of a time context, the mills opened in the early 1840s, as I say, about 1843. And by 1861, I think, Mary, you can correct me, they had quite a big fire actually in the mill. And you can get a sense of the entrepreneurial spirit of the age instead of sort of being down in the mouth about this major fire, which was a common hazard, I think, to the 19th century just about everywhere. They actually used it as an opportunity to take advantage of steam power that was coming in very strongly at the time. Because the milling industries, especially in textiles, it was a major capital investment for an entrepreneur or a set of partners to actually capitalize their business to make the shift from water power to steam power. And that's what they did. And by the mid-1880s, the barbers were no longer involved in the textile milling. However, what we do have is the site is still there. The buildings are still there. They're behind more modern cladding, kind of a funny-looking green metal cladding. But the site is still there, and the actual relationship between that industrial milling complex and the Credit Valley and the whole area is one of the richest sites that we have. I would suggest in Ontario in terms of industrial heritage. It would probably be quite a rich site. This is actually the Barber House photograph this summer, albeit in black and white. We borrowed this from our booklet. But this is the Barber House today. What's really interesting is you look at the houses across the street from the Barber House and you think, wow, one mill owner owned that house, and that was quite the place at the time in relation to the local houses. And yet today, across the street, this looks smaller than some of the big structures that have gone in, albeit this guy had more land. I'm just going to run through a few sites here, or a few shots here that give you just a sense of Credit Valley in relation to the site. These shots were taken in the late 70s, I think, early 80s. You can see a little bit of the structure there. This was before the cladding went up. As I say, I wish I had the actual drawing from the historical atlas. You can actually see in the historical atlas the actual positioning of the buildings in relation to what functions were done. The tenting of the fabric, the bleaching of it outside, the footbridge, the railway track. You got a real sense of how this place was working. And it's a little bit under it.
And Marie, who owns this building now?
Right now it's ABM milling. It's for about 100 years now, been a flour milling complex.
Okay.
Yeah. So Streetsville's always had a really strong milling heritage, whether it's been textiles or grist mills. It's always had a strong milling heritage, and it's directly attributable to the location of the river. And that's today's little reminder. As I say, it's variously known as Barbertown, as in Barbertown Road, or Barberton, as in Barberton Park. And you can see the context there. And this is a bit too dark. I'll leave it to yourselves to go up and pack yourselves. But this was the plaque that was erected by the Ontario Heritage Foundation on the 15th of September. You know, a long time coming and long overdue as a recognition of a very vital community in Toronto Township. But all said and done, considering how big a complex it was, there's just not a lot left of Barbertown. Okay, one of the things you might notice that a lot of what I've chosen to call lost villages are in the northern part of Mississauga, which is also an area that corresponds with our more modern development. Britannia is one of those areas. And this is an older photograph of a building that's familiar, I'm sure, to some of you. And Britannia, the village of Britannia was Kenny Road in Highway 10, was also known as Garner's Corner, after one of the families in the Garner family. And it was changed in honor of the country of Britain. The church and cemetery are still standing. This is the Chisholm Garner Dunton house. I always mispronounce that. This is actually a very beautiful photograph of it, albeit not in a restored state. But this is a view of the home before it was restored in the context of the Britannia School Farm. But it just kind of gives you a little bit of a feeling for the vegetation and things like that around the home. It's a little bit more of a natural kind of setting than this, which is what we have today. And I don't know if you can see it, but I guess not. But actually, in one angle, you can see the City Hall clock tower as you're looking at this. This was restored a number of years ago with a lot of assistance from the Orlando Corporation. And sadly, the Britannia School Farm has been quite a victim of cutbacks, not the Britannia Schoolhouse program, but the farm program. But in any event, just a really, really gracious home of the 19th century, 1860s, I think. In any event, another familiar structure is going to be the old Britannia Schoolhouse. I suppose Mississauga, if they share anything with a lot of communities, it's the little red brick schoolhouse. It's almost an archetype of a building to have. This one here is where they have school programs for children. I don't know, I'm going to make an assumption that local people anyway are familiar with some of the programs there, and they invite children to live a day in the life of a school child, say in the 1920s or 30s. Even though this building, I believe, is 1852, it was restored in the 1980s and has been pretty active ever since. But a good source of information about school life and the kind of oral history behind it is found in Ben Medill's book. And Ben himself, if you can track him down, he's pretty busy at a lot of community events, just sort of showing various things like how to make skipping ropes and how to make rope and making toys like they used to and things like that. But Ben is quite knowledgeable about the area. But anyway, that's the front door of Britannia Schoolhouse. And just to give you a little bit of an idea, just the overall context. The building just behind, some of you may recognize, that's just the roof line of the Peel School Board offices. And even though those are modern design, the idea was to try to somehow or other honor the shape, not quite sure if it worked, but to honor the shape of the architectural design of the original schoolhouse. But in any event, the church and the cemetery, which I have, I think, next, are still standing. and actually quite a small community, but still quite active. Actually, they're very concerned about the future of their site because it's right on Highway 10. Certainly, the masonry alone has suffered just because of the constant traffic in the area. Britannia, as I said, we're back to our post offices. It opened its post office in 1863. By 1877, it actually was on the maps. It had a wagon shop, a brick church, the schoolhouse, as I mentioned. Actually, the brick schoolhouse was a replacement of an earlier one that was built in the 1830s. It was a blacksmith shop and a carpenter shop. To tell you the truth, most of the contents of these villages and hamlets sounded the same from hamlet to hamlet, village to village. You know, you had the basic elements of just meeting basic needs, and some of them, if there was a distinction to be made between the ones that survived and the ones that didn't, the ones that survived had a real stake in a milling complex, for starters, in the earlier part of the 19th century. And that allowed it to sustain some economic development or economic activity enough that it could survive not just on its local population, but in attracting people from outside. Places like Mannaville and Streetsville didn't rely on their own communities for their economic base. And in 1915, on July 1, no less, the post office closed. I know that this particular site has had its struggles with everything from the Tim Hortons drive-through, driving, like, if you were to take a less reverent photograph, you'd be able to show the drive-through looking like it's going right through the cemetery. The juxtaposition is really incredible, and it's very, very, it really jogs your mind, and it's really hard to get a sense of village life by going through the hamlets and villages of Mississauga. But it's a really attractive building of its period, and actually Mississauga's got a number of really nice red brick churches from the 19th century that are still in pretty good shape. Just up the road from here, we have Derry West, and that's all that's left of it. Across the corner from this little cemetery is the Olympic Flame, and there's a gas station on another corner, but that's all that's left of Derry West. And I've passed this little cemetery many, many times, but it wasn't until recently that I took the time to actually get out and look at the plaque. And actually, that's nice. We got a lot of detail on this plaque. A lot happened in Derry West. It was an early Irish settlement, 1819. It was named after Londonderry and Ireland, and had a post office by 1851, which is a little bit earlier than some of the other ones. In 1859, it had the Church of England, Presbyterian Church, 2 inns, a shoemaker, a schoolhouse, a store. It had an orange hall and a hotel by 1877. This was not just a quiet little corner. In 1882, 1904, 1906, and 1915, the post office was opening and closing. I'm going to touch at the end a little bit on some of the common threads that run through some of these in terms of, you know, why they disappeared and things like that. But in any event, this was erected by the local Women's Institute. Really, if it weren't for the local Women's Institutes in places like Clarkson and Streetsville and Mannaville, and obviously Derry West, we wouldn't have this kind of record at all. One thing that had surprised me when I looked at it, I hadn't seen a reference to arm-based, and that's something I'll have to look into. Some brick arm-based, the time of the being raised in 1816. 1860s were exciting for any community that had an Irish heritage in Upper Canada. Anyway. Okay, so if you travel along, you'll notice that I've been sticking to kind of the northwestern corner of Mississauga. You travel along Derry Road, which right today is a very busy thoroughfare with a lot of truck traffic. Highest concentration of truck businesses in the entire country is right in that area, and it's really hard just to be able to get it quiet enough to feel like you're back at a certain point in time. You know, and sometimes it just helps. It's one thing to see places, it's another thing to try and get a feeling for it. I don't know if anybody recognizes this. It's not a house familiar to me by name, other than the fact that it's one of only 2 remaining residential structures in what was known as the village of Mount Charles. It was also known as King's Corner or Kingsville, and it was named originally for the King family, particularly after Charles King Sr. And he had settled here in the early 1800s. Just behind it is quite an elaborate temple. I'm not sure what faith. I think it's a Sikh temple just to the north of it.
Excuse me, where is this exactly?
That's Dixie and Derry Road. Okay, thank you. On the northwest corner.
And in Derry, was that in between?
Sorry?
The village of Derry, was that in between 10 and 6?
The village of Derry, it was actually called Derry West, and it was actually at Derry Road and Highway 10.
And the rest is
West of here, yeah. We're traveling now on Derry Road toward St. Etobicoke in Halton. And this is basically one of the few structures left in Mount Charles. This building sadly has really come into a lot of disrepair in the past few years. I remember looking at it a few years ago. It was really quite attractive. As I said, it was originally named for the King family, Charles King. And it was changed. It had its own post office by 1862. And it was named at that point Mount Charles, rather than King's Corners. And by that point, Charles Sr.'s son, Charles Jr., was the village storekeeper and postmaster. And again, you get that pattern of the post office being in the store. It was actually on the map, Mount Charles, by 1877, but by later maps it was off the map again. And the post office closed again in the summer of 1915. Today, all that's left of Mount Charles, in addition to the house that I just mentioned, is this particular residence. It's called the Ray property. And if I'm not mistaken, it's still a whole, basically this is the southwest corner of Dixie and Derry Road. And as you can appreciate, with that kind of intersection, with that kind of traffic, I know that at one point the Region Appeal was looking at widening the roads in the area. And the treasure of this particular, it looks a bit run down there, but the treasure of this particular site is not just a particular building or another, it's the fact of a certain combination of buildings that can give you a little bit of a hint of what went on. This is the blacksmith shop. And actually there aren't many blacksmith shops left in Mississauga. This building alone is of some interest. Signs everywhere saying beware of the dog, and thankfully I didn't know that. And this is another shed to the side. But it's just the whole idea of a complex. You have the house, the smithy, and the carriage shed. Sorry, blacksmith shop, carriage house, and the house itself. And you can see the sign suggesting future commercial development. And that's it for Mount Charles. We don't know a whole lot about Mount Charles, except that there seemed to be some kind of business relationship between some of its residents and some folks in the village of Burnthorpe, further south on that Dixie Road. So now we're going to go south on Dixie Road, okay, toward Burnthorpe.
Future development, does that mean demolition?
Not necessarily. It's not necessarily. Although I guess if somebody really wanted to develop the property, if they really wanted to develop the property with imagination, you could develop that property commercially and retain the buildings. But I don't know where the road widening issue is, because at one point that was really quite an issue. A number of, as you can appreciate, the villages and hamlets and the places that became some of the main commercial structures were located, not surprisingly, on main concession roads. And so by the late 20th century, they're obviously the ones that are going to fall victim. And actually the site I'm going to show you now is in a similar sort of situation, but it's been better kept because it's just a little off the corner. But it doesn't necessarily need demolition, but I suspect that the road lighting issue is something that I was actually surprised to see this sign because I wouldn't think that you'd have commercial development if we were going to widen the road. Actually, before we go to the village of Burnthorpe, there's a little cemetery on Dixie Road in Britannia. Okay, it's on the southeast corner, and it's hard to actually get to this for the truck traffic. It's an incredibly busy corner, and I'm not quite sure which village is associated with this particular cemetery. There was a Wesleyan Methodist church in the area in the 1870s, and there is a record of this cemetery having been there in the 1870s. And you could see at one point it was very well cared for. You don't put that kind of a fence around that small of a property without somebody having really cared about it. And yet someone was known about it, and actually the fence is in quite a state of disrepair on one side. But I'm not quite sure which village this is associated with. It's actually between Elm Bank. Between Elm Bank on the east and let's see. Yeah, Elm Bank on the east and a place called Hanlon's Corner on the west. In any event, I've brought along a copy of the 1877 map of the township, so that afterwards, if you just want to get a little bit of an orientation of some of these places, you can do that. That's not to suggest that these maps are the only ones to use for reference, because the 1859 map is also an excellent one, and using those maps, you can just see the coming and the going of some of these places very, very nicely. I've got those up at the front, if you want to have a look later on. But in any event, this is that little mystery cemetery. You can see the back gate. And again, the size of the monument. I mean, you know very little about it.
Does the size of the monument have anything to do with how prominent the person was in the community? Fairly well-to-do person with a lot of status, usually?
I would say that it usually has something to do with the economic well-being of that person. Whether or not that person had prominence is a separate matter. They can be the same, but sometimes people have prominence, no money. But generally, yes, you can generally assume that this is somebody. In fact, I think one of the names on Balduck or Bulldog is one of the names. And looking at the old maps, I could see that that name is associated with a fair bit of farmland around there. So these were people who owned some land. So we're going to travel south from Dixie Road, and this isn't a Top Gun cemeteries. At least that's not the intention. And this is at the village of Burnthorpe, Dixie and Burnthorpe Road. This is actually on the southwest corner, and you see the name Stanfield on that stone. Part of the reason they photographed it that way was that there's a fruit market in the background there. And while it's not a particularly historic fruit market, there's been a fruit market on that corner for almost 100 years by one family or another. And that seems to have been a common denominator. The village of Burnthorpe was named after Burnthorpe in England, the birthplace of Lord Admiral Nelson. And by 1820s, there was evidence of this particular village. It got its post office in 1862. And that's the point at which it changed its name to Burnthorpe from Sand Hill. There was a Sand Hill in Albion further north, and there was some confusion. This happened a lot in Toronto Township. The same thing happened with Arundel when it changed its name because it was really confused with Springfield, Ohio. And this kind of thing happens a lot. And I'm surprised it doesn't happen more along the main streets in Dundasses and Kings and Queens and things like that. But it was named, as I said, after Burnthorpe, England, at the suggestion of John Abelson. I don't know very much about John Abelson, know nothing at all really about him. Often names were suggested just by a local community member. That certainly happened in actually most of the communities here in Mississauga. By the 1860s and 70s, you could call that the peak of the village. Now, when I say the peak of the village, we're talking about a population of max 150 people. And Burnthorpe was known, it had a blacksmith shop run by a gentleman by the name of Savage. And he was the gentleman I was saying earlier it seemed to have some kind of an association with Charles King from Mount Charles. And it had a tavern, general store, a Methodist church. Actually, the church still remains. There's a lot of construction now on Dixie Road. It's really hard to get a good view of it. The church still remains, not as a Methodist church, but it's still there. It was built in 1875. There was a one-room schoolhouse, which was on the site of the present-day Burnthorpe District Library, and Sons of Temperance Hall. As a matter of fact, in addition to the general store and the post office, it seemed like there was a Sons of Temperance Hall in just about all of these villages. So I don't know. It seems like the post office is closed in 1915, and then you got Prohibition in the 1920s. Maybe that's why the villages disappeared. I don't know. But in 1879, the Credit Valley Railway was introduced to the whole area, and about a mile south of the village of Burnthorpe was a CPR line. And basically Burnthorpe was a sort of a typical village in the sense that it got bypassed by both of them. And that's one denominator that seems to run through some of the communities in trying to explain why they just didn't survive in the 19th century. If in the middle of a market economy, which it was, agriculturally speaking, you didn't have access to markets, and things were moving away from a stagecoach era to a railway era, and then into an automobile era, your location and proximity to the transportation routes had a lot to do to explain why you survived or didn't. So while agriculture was still important in the area, the village itself became less of a meeting place, which is essentially what it had been during its stagecoach years. The cemetery itself is actually it's officially listed as an abandoned cemetery, and just to give you a sense of the residential, it's not residential, but I'll get to it. The Moore Stanfield House, which is a designated heritage property, just a little bit, well, it's in Burnthorpe, it's about a block west. I have to visualize myself driving through these areas to get it straight.
That's Hickory.
That's correct.
Hickory.
Yeah. The Moore Stanfield House, which I'll show you in a second, the property itself is a wonderful example of just different types of building fabric and purpose. And this is a wonderful old, I would call it a shed, but actually probably a carriage house, machine shop type of a place. Just getting at the shed itself. The property's been very well kept up. It's actually operating, I think, now as a kind of a natural health and aromatherapy type of clinic, and was a real estate office for a while. But in any event, this is basically what's left of Burnthorpe, the village. There's a lot of interesting heritage properties that are sort of loosely dotted between some of these areas. A little bit west of here is the Copeland House, which is a stone home from the 1820s, but they're not really, you don't really get a sense that there's much left of an actual village, not in the same way that you might go somewhere else and just see a little corner where you've got maybe, in today's terms, a few little boutiques residing in what had been a really happening place. And I mentioned, I hope, the library site was where the old school used to be. If you were to travel south on Dixie Road, okay, toward Dundas, and you were to turn left, which is east, and go towards the Etobicoke Creek, you'd come to a community called Somerville. It used to be called Silverthorns, or Mill Place actually. It's one of the earliest business centers of Mississauga, which in an ironic way is still true. Dundas, and the far eastern portion of Dundas in Mississauga is one shopping plaza after another. But it's Dundas Street west of Etobicoke Creek, and basically that area was settled in about the 1820s, with milling being one of the earliest businesses in the area, the Silverthorne family being the ones to bring it to the area. And actually this will be the same Silverthorns in connection with Meadowvale Village. And that name is so important to the milling heritage of Meadowvale.
For a second, if they were milling, is there a creek there?
Not here, this is back up Bertha, okay.
They're meaning
Etobicoke Creek.
Etobicoke Creek, okay?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And the name was changed in 1851 to Somerville. And this will sound familiar: a church, general store, wag shop, taverns. The only difference here in Somerville was the fact that it had a steam grist mill. And actually, because of its location, and Dundas is still a thoroughfare right through Mississauga today, but because of its location, when Dundas Street was paved in 1915, what Somerville had relied a lot on financially was a few businesses connected with stagecoaches. And stagecoaches meant you had a carriage shop, and it meant you had a blacksmith. And but Somerville all but disappeared, except for the blacksmith shop and a couple of other little places, by about the early part of the 20th century. There was a blacksmith in operation right through to 1958, and actually I didn't bring this thing I meant to. There was a wonderful stone blacksmith shop in Somerville, and it was dismantled in 1979, not demolished, but dismantled. Nobody seems to know where it is. You know, it's quite possible that it was one of the very early rescue efforts in terms of architectural preservation, and just through lack of collective memory or record keeping or something, it's quite possible those stones are somewhere and they're numbered. But it's a wonderful, wonderful building, and when that disappeared in 1979, basically that was it of Somerville. The names of some of these villages you can see having been picked up by some local developers, either of their own initiative or at the suggestion of city officials. And you'll see certain names like Somerville and so on and so forth. And the same with Lisgar, the community we started with. But that's basically it. So even our namesakes and street names are to be, you know, carefully, carefully held. But in any event, as I say, the paving of Dundas Street basically allowed the motorists to bypass Somerville. And this is something that you'll see has happened in little areas of Mississauga through. I'm just going to touch on a couple of communities for which I don't have any visuals, and that certainly were villages in their own right. One of them in particular is the Credit Mission at QEW and Mississauga Road. And for those who are not familiar with that area, it's the Mississauga Golf and Country Club. And all that remains of the Mississauga Indian village that was there is a plaque stating what was there. But basically you had I'm getting my centuries mixed up. From 1826 to 1847, you had quite a village of activity there with about 50 log homes or cabins. You had a chapel, you had a schoolhouse, and basically until 1826, a lot of the Mississaugas, who numbered only about 260 at the time, had resided in the Port Credit area at the mouth of the Credit, basically, and had been living in this area from about 1700, after they had ousted the Iroquois from the area. But just to put it in some kind of historical perspective, we've been doing this a little geographically here. I'm throwing it back chronologically, I apologize. But basically in Mississauga, you had a lot of people refer to the first and second purchases of the land which became developed as Mississauga is today. Actually, there were several purchases. That seems to be a very convenient turn of phrase. But the first purchase refers to in 1805, when the second purchase refers to the conclusion of one in 1820. And the interesting thing about that is one of the things you'll notice in Mississauga that distinguishes it from other communities with a river running through it, especially a river as huge and as significant as the Credit, is the fact that you typically see the earlier homes, the earlier farms, the earlier industries right on the river. So that was the source of power. That was the source of power for your gristmill, your carding mill, and so on. Not so in Mississauga. It was the source of power. But when the Mississauga signed their first land treaty in 1805, they retained a mile on either side of that Credit River. And it wasn't until 1820 that they let that go as well in the agreement of the second purchase, reserving for themselves a couple of hundred acres near the area that I referred to as the mission site. So what you have is basically, if you think of all the immigration that was happening after the post-Napoleonic Wars, and you think of the pressure in terms of Upper Canada on the land, you can start to appreciate what the pressure was on that 1 mile either side of the river, because that's where the power was. And basically it wasn't until 1820 that any substantial economic development in this area could begin at all. So it helps to explain a little bit what the main transportation and development axes were to Mississauga, whether it was the Credit River or Dunton Street or what have you. Now I mentioned that the Mississaugas had retained a couple of hundred acres. The interesting thing, but we're just a bit confusing. I'm certainly no scholar of the period, that's for sure, but in retaining the 200 acres, it's evident that the land which they retained was not the land they in fact lived on. So there's still a lot of research to be done in that whole area, because the village was on one side of the Credit River, but the land that they had reserved is on the other. But nonetheless, all we have as a reminder in a physical sense is a plaque, and that's it. The landscaping of the Mississauga Golf and Country Club would bear no resemblance to the landscape of the day. But that's certainly one village that has come and gone, and actually in an odd sort of way, because it was a planned community. It was actually maybe arguably one of the first planned communities in Mississauga, almost like the mining communities in northern Canada in the 1950s and 60s, and within one generation they've come and they've gone. And that's basically what happened in Mississauga with a lot of these communities. And I'll touch on some reasons, as I said, for that in a couple of minutes. Okay, let's go back to where we were a little bit geographically. I had referred to a community called Elm Bank, and there's nothing left of Elm Bank. You might see the name, you might see a part of the name referred to here and there, Elm. Basically, we're talking about the international airport in Etobicoke Creek Junction area, and it was named, there were signs in the village there around the early 1830s. A gentleman by the name of John Grubb built a home on the bank of the river, and it's suggested that the name Elm Bank was the name of his estate, named for the elm trees. Very, very original, but a lot of the names, place names, relate to things that were there at the time. Maybe they don't seem that original to us now, but if they were named after elm trees, I mean, that alone is something. We don't have many of those around either, you know. So those names are significant. By 1873, it had a post office, and by 1877, it was on the historical atlas map, along with a lot of the other communities, and it also lost its post office in July of 1915. Right now, basically, all that remains of Elm Bank is a bit of cemetery, and it's basically been obliterated by the whole airport and highway infrastructure that we've got up there. It is not the same community as Richview, which kind of borders Mississauga and Etobicoke. And many of you who may have been traveling the 427 North as you exited west onto the 401 will notice this funny little cemetery trapped in the middle of all these laneways. It's a bit of a challenge just to figure out how to get in there, but people do, and they do report it. But that's actually, I believe, the cemetery for Richview. And as I say, that is on the border of I guess actually Richmond was more in Etobicoke actually than it was in Mississauga. Yeah. But in any event, there's a couple of places that I'm just going to throw out for which we have no physical reminders at all. I don't know if anybody's heard of the village Frogmore, strange name in itself. Suggested that it was named by the first postmaster, a guy named Anderson. Suggestion that it was named because he heard the frogs in the marsh in the springtime. There were a lot of marshes certainly in that area. And actually, if you look at some old maps, you'll see a lot of little creeks and tributaries and marshes written right on the old maps, and you wonder where they are today. But I guess people would leave the basements. I don't know. But Frogmore was at Dundas Road, and Winston Churchill Boulevard. There's not really anything left there. It actually had its post office in the 1880s, which is interesting because by the 1880s, most of the villages and hamlets that I've been talking about had come in and gone, with the exception of maybe their post office. Another one that for which there's no physical remains is a little community called Hanlon, which was named after the famous oarsman, Ned Hanlon, who was a Canadian-American and I think an international rowing champion. And he, right through the 1880s, he died in 1908 at a fairly young age of 53. But I don't know what his connection with Toronto Township was. There's Hanlon's Point, I think on Toronto Island. There's a few connections like that. But I don't really know what his connection was with Toronto Township, so that might be interesting to pursue. It also got its post office later, and keep in mind when I say post office, as I said, for most of these communities, that was a big deal. That was a really, really big deal. When I showed you the plaque for Barberton, it's in a little park where the local residents have to come to a little set of mailboxes that are under a little kiosk. And it's just a very different way to come and collect your mail. There's nobody there to talk to. And they're exposed to the elements. It's not like going inside a building and saying hello. And just the only way that you can really imagine what it might have been like village life is to really, really put your mind into it, because there's not a lot left for us to work with, except in the names that remain. A couple of really small little spots on references were Harris's Corner at Derry Road and 401. It's no longer there. But it did have a foundry, a grist mill, a general store, and so these latter communities that I'm talking about are places where we've only really seen a couple of references, or the odd reference on the map, and that's about all we know about them. Hawkins Corner, Eglinton and Dixie.
Where was Hanlon? Where was it?
Hanlon was at Britannia and Tonkin. That was one of the communities I thought might be associated with the little cemetery that I mentioned. That cemetery was basically between Hanlon and Elmbank. But the Hawkins Corner, not surprisingly, was named after a guy named William Hawkins. In the 1830s, it had a blacksmith shop and a carpenter shop. It didn't have a post office, and actually there are correlations between those that had, as I said, the little shops and post offices and those that stayed around for a little while. Palestine, it's an unusual name for a community in Toronto Township. And it was at the corner of Derry and Kennedy Road. There's nothing left there now. The Tremaine map of 1859 does show that there was a name on the southwest corner. There was also a church by 1871, the Primitive Methodist Church. And actually, by 1877, it was also on the map. An interesting little tidbit from this community was that it had its basic four corners, and it had a church, a school, a store, and a tavern. And it became known as Salvation, Education, Damnation, and Starvation. So it had it all covered. I guess today we have the gas station and the donut shop, but the whole concept of the four corners meeting our basic needs is still true.
Now you have four corners of all bags. TV, Canada Trust.
Yeah. So, I mean, sometimes it's just kind of interesting to see in some funny ways that where we have our main intersections and four corners, the things that people do at those four corners hasn't really changed a lot. It's just that they look different, the feeling's different, the traffic is busier. But in any event, there's nothing left of Palestine either. Here's an interesting one by name, if nothing else, Pucky's Huddle. Does anybody know where Pucky's Huddle was? Marion, you would.
It was on the Colorado, that's what I know.
Tompkin and Bernard Road, named after a hotel, which catered to local farmers, basically. And I mean, it was a hamlet. Well, it was called Second Line at the time, but basically Tompkin and Bernard area. There's nothing left of it now. I don't think we're surprised as to why that name didn't get picked up on any of the street signs. But, and just one other little village to bring to your attention, Sheridan, at Winston Churchill and QEW. There's not much left of Sheridan, but Sheridan, interestingly enough, in namesake alone, has survived better than a lot of other communities. Sheridan Homeland, Sheridan Research Park, those kinds of things. Sheridan Mall, yeah. So, but it's a community that was in evidence by about the early 1820s. You could see some evidence of the village. Actually, there was an inn there, I think owned by a gentleman named Pollard, is the family name, quite an early inn. And, but it was once called Hammondsville, named by William Ransom Hammond, a Pennsylvania native who opened a general store and settled there. And among one of the first settlers in the area was a gentleman by the name of Orange Lawrence, who became the founder of Orangeville. And it had a post office by 1857, and actually the post office for Sheridan, I've heard it said by some residents that it kind of bounced from Peel County to the next county, back and forth, depending on who had the contract and which general store. It was named Sheridan actually after the Irish playwright, Richard Brinsley Sheridan. But I mean, why name it after that particular playwright? Whose favorite playwright was it? I mean, who named it after that? I mean, these references all ask more questions than they answer them, which can be frustrating or interesting. But also, I had seen one reference to the fact that there was a little cairn somewhere to depict what was left of the village. I just haven't found it. But as I say, Sheridan is one area that seems to survive a little bit better just through name. And you'll see, the importance of namesake, especially as some of the older communities have been disappearing, is becoming more and more important in Mississauga. The other thing is the Hammond home, which is sometimes considered part of Arundel, could just as easily be considered part of northern Sheridan. Sheridan is basically kitty corner on the southwest from Arundel. And it's a beautiful 1866 home that's been restored over the past several years by the Qureshi family, and at great expense to them too. But it's a very, very good example of gentleman farmers' established home from the 1860s. And actually, architecturally, the verge board on the front gable actually is very typical of Peel County and has been referred to as the Peel County design. You'll see that here and there throughout Peel County. On the boathouse in Meadowvale area, you'll see it on the Brown McCarty House in Streetsville. So residentially speaking, that's just about all that's left of that particular area. Mary?
I'm on the Heritage Advisory Committee for the City of Mississauga, and at the moment there is a petition by the Qureshi family to make an addition to the Hammond House. And there's been a great deal of controversy over this addition because the initial plans were totally unsuitable to the basic structure and the basic ambiance of the house. And we have now asked that this be changed because we are not pleased with what they propose to do. Because if they had gone ahead, it certainly would have not been a lovely place and would have totally destroyed the ambience of the house.
It's certainly, I mean, as I say, residentially speaking, and I'm not quite sure if it's officially part of Sheridan or Arundel, but it's quite a handsome structure. I think built in 1866 by Oliver Hammond. But the last few communities, as I said, were ones for which we have just about no remaining, physically remaining evidence. Oh, I overlooked our little house in Somerville. That's not there anymore. That's why. I just came across this old slide, and this was not the blacksmith shop, but this was so okay. I understand. Just so I guess with all these villages and hamlets and things like that, some questions come to mind. Basically, like what happened to them? You know, what really happened to them? One of the things, I'll just throw out some ideas in terms of perspectives on 19th century villages in Mississauga. One of the earliest social history, or quantitative history, they called it in the 1970s, was done by David Gagan, a social historian. And actually, this already seems historical because they were using computer cards to generate and deal with their research, which is an interesting reference because in its time, it was quite the study. But he did an exhaustive study on Peel County, basically looking at, in a statistical form, the lives of people who were living here, and just the lives of ordinary people. And oftentimes our traditional history books have been written, as I say, history is written by the victors. But traditionally speaking, until about the 1960s, 70s, a lot of our histories were written by and about famous or more prominent citizens, many of them men, many of them politicians. And his was a very major study to kind of get at, what were real people going through in the 19th century. And he describes the character of the 19th century population of Peel County as one that was in perpetual motion. This is a term he used a lot in his book, Hopeful Travelers. But in the mid-19th century, families were constantly on the move. Actually, when I was reading some of his material, it sounded very like today. I actually read a passage to Cheryl in our office, and I said, when was this written about? And she said, oh, now. I said, well, it was written about the 1860s. Again, some things don't change, but a quarter of those people who had been enumerated had been there at the last census. That's not a lot of people. Only a quarter of the people staying in one spot from census to census, which for those of you maybe not aware that we're taking every 10 years, usually we do 51, 61, and so on. 47% of Peel farmers in 1851 were not there a decade later. Three-fifths of farm families on the 1860-61 census were gone by 1870. The exodus continued right through to the 19th century, and actually the phrase rural, I always have trouble pronouncing that, rural depopulation was a term used very frequently to describe the late 19th century. And one of the reasons behind this was the whole uncertainty, the economic uncertainty of the times. Just to kind of give you an overview of maybe the different eras within the 19th century, and just think back to some of our villages. The 1820 to mid-1840s period was the pioneer era. People started settling here. They started clearing the land and starting their farms. Very optimistic times, but economically and socially pretty underdeveloped here in Peel County. By 1830, while 40% of the land had been taken or accounted for, either rented or bought, about 10% of it, or less than 10% of it, was actually improved land. So there's a lot of work yet to be done. By 1835, things had picked up and about a quarter of it had been improved. By the mid-1840s to 1862, we had seen rapid agricultural improvement, population increase, social improvement, and a very buoyant wheat economy, except for a couple of glitches there, off and on. But basically, by the 1860s, you'd seen this whole area come and go through. The whole pioneer era had basically ended. by the mid-19th century. By 1846, for example, the increased wheat markets had prompted the increased agricultural growth, and the population increase had been propelled in large part by the potato famine in Ireland. A lot of people don't associate wheat growing with this area. You know, our sense of the historic crops here is the strawberries and the apples and things like that. If you think about it, apple trees don't grow naturally in rows. That's a human intervention on the landscape, as indeed wheat farming would be. But the thing is, wheat farming in this area, this was one of the big hubs of activity in the earlier mid-19th century for the wheat economy in Canada. And Meadowville played a big role in that. And from a point of view of distribution and transportation of that crop, Malton can attribute a lot of its significance to that.
I know those grist mills.
Yeah.
What were they grinding? You had to grind something.
Yeah. Yeah. As I said, by 1850, we basically reached the end of our pioneer stage. Sometimes we have this perception that the 19th century kind of came and stayed the same, and then we had the 20th century. And it just didn't work that way. We had a lot of, by the 1870s then, you could safely say that we'd seen a lot of farm expansion. Actually, one of the things that was always sought was more land, especially if you wanted the land for your children. And by the 1860s, you know, there were a lot of uncertain economic times, and that was no longer a certainty. And actually, farm families of the day were actually a lot smaller than we think, and in light of that. By the 1860s, the land was not only scarce, what there was of it was pretty expensive. And we find that strange maybe today to think of the land as scarce, but even though people may have been absentee landlords, the land was basically occupied or accounted for. But as compared to, say, the 1820s, early 1820s. By 1870, though, we see a marked demographic decline. The population starts dropping in this particular area, and it basically never recovered until about 1950. That's an incredible stretch of time. And even by 1890, for that matter, the population had been virtually unchanged from 1850. So if you think about some of these things in the context of some of the villages, you know, you start to think, well, if people were moving, and I heard a few years ago in an economic development study here at the city where the rate of transience was, and this was probably going back half a dozen years, was every 3 years in Mississauga that people would move. Then maybe we share a lot in common with some of these earlier settlers, because basically people move because they seek improvement. They seek improvement for their families, or they seek self-improvement or something like that. That's never really changed. So some of, just in conclusion, some of the factors that influence the location and disappearance of these communities then would be, we've touched on a couple of them, would be their proximity to main thoroughfares, whether that was the concession road during the stagecoach era. And you'll see some of that just by looking at a map at a glance. If you know nothing about this area, you can pick that out. Later, that location, which made it good, when stagecoaches were bustling back and forth, made it very vulnerable. When those roadways were then paved in the early 20th century, it meant that these new fangled things, as cars were called, could very quickly bypass that community just as easily and get to the next one, particularly Toronto. So the other thing was railways. Where were the villages and hamlets, either in connection to the railways or those other communities that had good links with those railways? Communities like Streetsville or Meadowvale or Malton, which had excellent railway links, or for that matter, the Port Credit area. You know, that was certainly, when you look through 19th century references, you see this whole depression among the community members because they got missed by the railway. It was a big, big deal for the railway to, quote, bypass that community, because it was a shot at access to economic markets. And if that got missed, it was basically, for a lot of communities, the death knell to those communities, except in a kind of a quaint residential, agricultural kind of a way. But that sense, that optimistic sense that, that the railway might come to our area had basically gone by about 1879 for a lot of the communities. And there's definitely a correlation then between the community whose role and activity declined in the overall township and the access to those market economies, particularly Toronto, because by the late 19th century, Toronto Township, we referred to it in part of the 20th century as the bedroom community of Toronto, but that really began in the 19th century, the whole idea that the farms and gardens of this particular area were bringing produce to market in Toronto. That was the big distribution point. And you see a lot of references, to people bringing things, getting up in the wee hours of the morning and getting on the horse and going down to the markets and things like that, particularly a little bit later on with the market gardening economy in the southern part of Mississauga. The other aspect about villages and hamlets is quite simply they located where there was a practical need. As I say, the junction of certain concession roads, there wasn't a lot to figure out. If there was a main roadway, you just wanted to have your general store where the business was going to be, or the stagecoaches were going to pass, or something like that. So there was a certain kind of self-evident pragmatism to the whole thing. And of course, those main concession roads have become our main thoroughfares today and might go a long way to explain why some of these little villages or hamlets have been basically destroyed by road widening, and just the 20th century progress. And I mentioned earlier too the survey patterns. South of Dundas Street and north of Dundas Street, we have very different survey patterns here in Mississauga. The area south of Dundas Street, most of it had been surveyed after the first purchase I referred to earlier, and the northern part, most of it had been surveyed after the second purchase, which was almost 15, 16 years later. And you get different patterns. Actually, most of the communities in the southern part of Mississauga seem to fare an awful lot better. They were more established communities. And indeed today, you go down there in south of the QW, you see more trees, you see a diversity of buildings, you see maybe not that many actual little villages and hamlets, but what there was in the sense of community has had a much higher staying power, I guess you could say. But so those are some of the reasons, and you factor into that personal reasons, as suggested by some of those statistics, that people just sort of coming and going. There were a lot of people who they didn't own land, but they worked on it. They were laborers, and they go from farm to farm. So you have to factor that into the whole thing. So you get your big issues like the railway and the transportation, then you've got ordinary people issues, people just seeking improvement. And that's actually the background behind Gagan's name of his book, Hopeful Travelers. They were hopefully traveling, always in pursuit of something better. And so those are some of the things that might explain the disappearance of them. But just in terms of villages then, I think just if I could close, I've mentioned that we're going to be looking at different aspects next week of the more established historic communities. Some of you may already know Verna May Weeks has published, I think at this point, almost half a dozen different books. She's lived in about as many places as she's written about, so she's very knowledgeable from a personal perspective and has quite a wealth of knowledge to offer. Knows an awful lot of people who were born and raised in areas about which she's going to speak next week, and next Wednesday night. And then the third lecture in our series is by a gentleman named Ron Brown. Some of you may have read his Ghost Towns of Ontario books or for his contributions to CBC or something like that. He's a geographer, photographer, author, and he'll be looking at vanished villages of Ontario. So we're going to go from the locally specific to the bigger picture, and he'll be also doing that with some slides. So that's all I have to offer this evening. But if people have some questions, the clock has been saying 4:45 for about the past several days, so I'm not been going by at all. I don't know what time it is. If somebody wants to tell me what time it is, we can do 10 to 9? Okay, means I was chatty as usual. Maybe we could just take a few moments. We're meant to be finished by 9 o'clock, but we're a little flexible here, I think.
Just one quick question about Hawkins Corner. You said it was a corner of Eglinton, and I didn't catch where that was.
Eglinton and Derry? No, they're Cameron. I get that mixed up with Cameron. Eglinton and Dixie.
Dixie. Okay, that was named after William Hawkins. Right?
William Hawkins.
Yes, okay. That's it.
Don't know very much about William.
You had said towards the end, you were saying how it was the pioneer era and the agricultural era, and how certain things progressed. And one of the things you said was the agricultural, but the land itself was improved, but also social improvements. What are social improvements?
Little things probably like when somebody would get a land grant, they had obligations to meet their settlement duties, as they were called, and you had to erect a structure of 16 by 20 feet minimum. You had to clear a portion of land for roadway in front of your house, all that kind of stuff. When you consider the circumstances of the day, just basically meeting your settlement duties was a big challenge for a lot of people. Social improvements might be, instead of putting in something to eat in the garden, you might put flowers in. It might be something that simple in terms of social improvements. Social improvements might have been something like having the time to devote to more cultural development of your community instead of just meeting your basic economic needs. So it's a little bit of a distinction there. And it's no different than today when somebody immigrates to this country. The first priority is to find a job, find a home, all that. And we traditionally don't see people having extra time to devote to some of those other finer things until basic things have been addressed. So that might have been what he was talking about in terms of social improvement. That certainly seems it. The other thing is there weren't cut and dry, cut-offs in terms of these different eras, but it's just trying to give you a sense. A lot of people think that the 19th century was all a bunch of pioneers. Well, it wasn't. It was highly industrial in this area, in certain areas, by a fairly early date, actually. Once the area had opened up for activity after 1820, there was no wasting time, particularly in the milling industries.
Did the First World War have anything to do with the closure of so many postal facilities within this particular area? Because it happened right in the middle of the First World War.
Yeah. I really don't know. I suspect not. I suspect it had more to do with the fact that these villages had basically survived their whole time, and there was really no particular need anymore. It was a rationalization of services, probably not unlike, as I said earlier, what was happening in the 1980s with post offices in outlying parts of Canada. And you see the same thing, I should mention, in railway stations. I alluded to it a little bit. If you lost your railway station, even recently, like Eastern Canada, they lose their railway station, they get really upset because that's the connection with the outside world. Not unlike that post office was in the 19th century. It's very important.
Does Mississauga plan on having historic plaques similar to Oakville or Old London?
You mean on properties or street sign?
No, on the individual houses?
There actually are a number of them on designated properties, but it's been an inconsistent program over the years. I think actually the plaquing program started in the late 70s, early 80s by the city. Actually, I think it was initiated by what was known then as the Local Architectural Conservation Advisory Committee. And I remember seeing lists of which properties would then get the plaques. But basically, as the expense went up, it became something that was inconsistently done.
Well, in Milton, they just have, and it goes to Oakville too, they have the name of the original owner, the date of residence, and then first occupation.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like a
It's
real
not
big
no.
thing.
No. In Mississauga, you do see them. They're blue plaques. They're about yay big. and they have like a gable in the middle with the Peel County, some people say gingerbread or birch bark pattern. That was the motif or logo, if you will, for the LACAC committee. And that's the designated mark for any City of Mississauga plaque on a building. And there's several of them. It's just that there's over, 400 different properties on the city's heritage inventory. About 115 or so, including the ones in Meadowvale Village as a lot, are actually designated. And such a small percentage of those have plaques. Some property owners don't want them because it calls attention to their home from a security perspective. But most people are kind of proud of them. But it's something that something the city could certainly look at, and it would do a lot to nurture a sense of history and community. There's no question. It's something that jumps out at you in other communities as you're traveling along.
Well, Old Milton, I didn't know Milton had an old area that's really quite charming.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if you go up there in December in the evening, it's quite a different feeling daytime and evening. And then the plaques they have are very modest, but it adds some context to.
We've been exploring, the Heritage Mississauga has been exploring the whole notion of historic signage with the city. We really had our eyes open in terms of the issues behind signage and things like that. But anyway, that's certainly something that has been suggested and that is being explored.
Yeah.
How that comes across, I'm not sure.
Sure. Okay, thanks.
Arthur, you had a question.
Yeah. What was the main consideration at the time when they brought in the post office in a particular community? Was it the population size?
I suspect it was population size, and the reason I say that is when you look at old commercial directories, for example, sometimes you'll just see the name of the place and the post office, but you tend to see a population of about 100 or 150 or whatever. I know that, for example, nowadays, and I suspect it was this way too many, many years ago, was that to be able to apply to be an incorporated village or town, you have to have a certain population base. Now, whether or not it was that formal with the post offices, I really don't know. It might have just been it might have been an informal suggestion of somebody, like that there was enough reason to have one there. And you see the same tradition as, we've kind of gone through having solely government-run post offices, and now you see the mail post services in drugstores and convenience stores and all that. And that's not unlike it was 130 years ago. It's gone sort of back a little bit. But, so I'm not sure. It may have just been an informal recognition on somebody's part that was needed. Some of the names for the places seem to have got onto the maps that way. So
I know up north in some little villages up north, my grandfather talked about very large numbers of young men going right around either during or shortly after the First World War to the United States for the big construction campaigns that were going on, for instance, in Detroit. And an awful lot of men migrated down to Detroit and then ended up in Windsor or even coming back later on in the 1920s and 30s into the small villages here in Ontario. So that may be another reason why you may see some of the villages shrink, because the kids who would have continued the villages got up and left.
Well,
And went to other places, because my grandfather certainly did.
Well, the other thing you have to keep in mind is that even if people didn't go to the States, they always went where their jobs were. By around the First World War in Canada, we were no longer an agricultural country. The population base was tilted more on the urban side than it was on the agricultural side, and it's been that way ever since. So young people didn't necessarily want to go back to the farm. And that's what you're saying. One of the destinations of choice was probably very nearby in the States. But even if they didn't go to the States, a lot of people just simply went to Toronto or wherever. Canada shares that, or Mississauga shared that with a lot of communities in Canada. That was just kind of the way things went. There's a question back too, I think. Oh,
Yes, Do you have a write-up about all those villages you're talking about tonight?
No, we don't actually, for a couple of reasons. One is we've put our effort so far into the publication of those little pamphlets you've seen on self-guided tours of the historic communities, the larger, the surviving communities, for the reason that in terms of interpreting local heritage, we felt that it's first important to get people to appreciate what's behind something that physically still is there, get them to appreciate what is remaining. And certainly part of the reason behind including lost villages of Mississauga in tonight's, in this particular series, was to fill that gap, because we recognize that there's all these different little villages that people kind of hear about, but they don't know where they are, they don't know kind of how they came and went. So we thought we'd try to address it in the lecture format. But in terms of, we even talked about a driving tour in Mississauga, but the fact is there's nothing really to point to. And from the point of view of really trying to encourage, not a lot anyway, but from a point of view of trying to encourage an appreciation for the physical remains of the community, we've always felt the starting point, especially with young people, is to start with what's there and then go from there. We have, I should mention that, especially for those of you who are familiar with the tour series, we have updated those and pulled them all together, and we're in the closing stages of printing a booklet of those that will be available for sale through our office and actually through different points of distribution in the city. And it'll be a booklet format. It's called Passport to the Past. It's something you can keep in your purse, in your car, and as you're traveling around the city, you can actually learn a little bit about Mississauga's past in that way. And it's got more in it than just the walking tours that we have printed so far. So we're doing things in little steps.
Leave room at the back for notes so that when you pass by one of these lost villages, you can write down
Notes.
such and such a corner, here's, where the such and such a cemetery from this garden.
Well, if I'm not very good at the editing, that might be what you get at the back, is a bunch of pages full of notes. But anyway, so we're trying to fill those gaps in that way.
And we were speaking about the village of Sheridan. I understand that Sheridan was one of the names being considered in this community, am I right?
It was in 1968. Mississauga and Sheridan were the two names bandied about. And the name Mississauga went out in deference to the native heritage of the area. But that says, it suggests something about the significance of Sheridan. Like, why Sheridan with Mississauga instead of one of these other communities?
A little Pucky's Huddle.
I don't know about a ballot. But, as I say, there's a lot, I find that a lot of these places just raise a lot of questions, I'd like us to be able to just find out a little bit more about the people who live here.
The village of Frogmore, can you tell me again where? When that was sort of around?
Okay.
Because I have heard of another place called Frogmore. It's where Queen Victoria is buried. And her husband is buried. Their mausoleum is in Frogmore, which is, I'm not sure whether it's just a location or something, but it's somewhere in Windsor Great Park. But it's called Frogmore.
Really?
Yes.
Now that sounds like a more plausible reason than frogs in the marsh. To tell you the truth.
The reason I'm asking is because Prince Albert died in 1841. And he was buried there, but Queen Victoria wouldn't have died till 1901. So I don't know, in the interim, I'm sure it was up Queen Victoria's mind, but I don't know how the general public, living in Peel County would Frogmore.
Well, we have a lot of place names in Mississauga that are based on either Ireland or Britain, basically.
Well,
so it could be, but
so I don't know if this was a village though where they're buried, but that's where their mausoleum is. It's called Frogmore.
It could be just named after a particular place. Because of its significance.
Well, to answer your question though, it was only there in the 1880s for a brief spell of time. There's just a few isolated references.
It was just after Prince Albert died, okay, or just after Queen Victoria maybe? I don't see it being
We're looking
prominent.
at 1886 to 1924.
Seems
On
on
and
and
off. So, anyways,
I was thinking about the census. You touched a little bit about the census. And I'm wondering what they would have done with the census then, and if it's used similarly today, if there's that much of a difference today.
In terms of its purpose or use?
Purpose and use, yeah.
Certainly the way the questions are asked has changed. But the purposes to which they were used have really not changed a whole lot. It's a basis and information, we would call it database nowadays, information base for making basic policy decisions, usually by government officials. What happens nowadays a little bit more, a lot more, is that different agencies will contract Statistics Canada to do various surveys on their behalf. So you get a lot more of that. But the purpose for which it was always intended was basically to find out who's living where and what are they doing. And I know, looking at, having used some of the old census returns, they were wonderful, wonderful records with detailed information. And the social history that we have, any reference them would just not be possible without them. You find out how many people in the household, what were their names, where were they from, where were they born, what was their religion, how many acres of peas did they clear that year, how big was their log cabin. I mean, the detail was just incredible. The challenge in using them, apart from trying to read them off the microphone sometimes, is just, well, sometimes the people who were hired to take the census were not literate, and sometimes you get misspelling, and when you're dealing with family history, that really messes you up. Margaret can vouch for that, I'm sure, the misspellings of names, and you can actually.
In my family, I think there's 3 different spellings.
Yeah, and you know, that's just fairly typical in terms of doing
And
family
they forget
history.
to dip their pen in the ink. And they start to do it once per page, and if your ancestors at the bottom of the page, you're out of luck.
It's all done very, very manually.
Yeah, you're laughing because you know what I'm talking about.
It's all done very manually. Their basic purpose hasn't really changed, just making out more
I asked
sense.
about handicap now. That's one big change since the last census. Do you have a disability or?
But see, in the old census returns, you'd often see that referred to, maybe not with those words, but it was referred to as invalid residing in the home. They weren't asked it, but they said it.
Imbecile might have been a word.
No.
Like,
Not really. Not really, just
Usually
usually.
that was not a
usually
socially acceptable thing, and that was something that was in. And that was one of the things that you'll notice about the old census records, that there were copyrights. And there were also age changes. Now, for example, my great uncle William Barber was 48 years old when he married his second wife, and his second wife was 16 years of age. But that is not in the census correctly at all, because I
Should be at 19 or whatever.
she added on to her age to try and fill in the gap in the census records.
You can't rely on ages.
So you can't, they're not totally.
They're a good guideline, they get you going to the next step. And I think the thing, if I could encourage you to just, if I could encourage you to look at historical records, it's just giving you a good bunch of questions and then going somewhere else and just, you know, enjoying the process of learning about things. Because sometimes, all too often, we find a record or a source, we go, aha, we found the answer. But as often as not, all you found is another good question. And, you know, if you take it in that spirit, you can have a lot of fun with it. So I think, unless there are any simmering questions, I just have to